Eli Granger's farm road, used by school buses and emergency crews for decades, was suddenly blocked by a steel gate, courtesy of an arrogant HOA chairman. Carl Yates, a suburban transplant, saw Eli's land as an eyesore and used legal loopholes to erase a lifeline the valley depended on. But Eli wasn't just a farmer. He was a former state detour coordinator with one last card to play. Just wait until you see how he turned the tables and made justice echo through that road like never before. Eli Granger had lived his entire life on that patch of land in the hills just outside of Willow Creek. He knew every fence post, every tree line, every bend in the road like the lines on his own hands, and of everything he'd inherited from his father and grandfather before him. The gravel road cutting across the north pasture meant the most. Not because it was beautiful, but because it mattered. That road wasn't just a convenience, it was a lifeline. When the river swelled in March and the main highway flooded, it was Eli's farm road that kept the community moving. Buses took kids to school that way. First responders saved lives that way. Local ranchers hauled feed, and families got groceries delivered thanks to that rough but reliable strip of gravel. No one ever asked permission, because they didn't have to. It was just understood. That road was part of the land, and the land belonged to the valley. So when Eli stepped out of his house one morning and saw a 6-foot steel gate bolted into the dirt where his road used to begin, he thought, for a second, that maybe it was a mistake. Maybe a contractor had fenced the wrong lot, or maybe the gate had been dumped there and would be gone by noon. But the sign told him otherwise. Closed by order of the Walnut Estates HOA. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It took him a minute to understand what he was seeing. Not just the barricade or the fresh concrete poured around the steel posts, but the finality of it. The gate wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the notice nailed to the frame, printed in sleek, laminated plastic, like it had come from a corporate office, not a country subdivision. Eli walked the line, scanning the edges of the fence. The whole road, as far as he could see across the ridge, had been erased, scraped over by bulldozers, reshaped with berms and drainage ditches to block through traffic. It wasn't vandalism. It was deliberate. And then the pieces started falling into place. A few months back, a new HOA had popped up just across the eastern fence line. Walnut Estates, 33 oversized houses and a clubhouse on land that had once been open pasture. It had started innocently enough. A few out-of-state buyers, fancy cars, a gate with a keypad. But as more homes filled in, the people running the place started treating the surrounding farmland like it was an intrusion. Eli had overheard the complaints at the co-op. Too much dust, too many trucks, roads too loud, too bumpy, not safe for walkers. But he never thought they'd actually try to shut it down. He called the county that afternoon and got shuffled from one office to another until a tired-sounding engineer explained that the HOA had filed a nuisance and visual pollution complaint, arguing the road compromised the neighborhood's peaceful character. Worse, they'd submitted a claim questioning the road's legitimacy altogether, saying it had never been legally recorded as a public right-of-way. And somehow, buried in the paperwork and procedural silence, the county had agreed. Eli's mouth went dry as he stood there, cell phone to his ear, listening to a stranger explain why the road his family had maintained since before World War II no longer existed on county records. "They closed it down, sir," the engineer said flatly. Technically, they were within their rights. The line went quiet after that. Eli didn't yell. He didn't storm the gate. He just stood in the early spring wind, staring at a piece of land that had been part of his life for 60 years, and was now off limits, fenced and sealed behind steel. The farm road was gone, and the land didn't feel like his anymore. Carl Yates wasn't from around Willow Creek. He didn't grow up hauling hay, didn't understand why people left trucks parked in fields, and certainly never saw a gravel road as anything other than an inconvenience. He came from a polished suburban life somewhere on the East Coast, retired early from a mid-tier job in tech, bought himself a brand new house in Walnut Estates, and within a month of moving in, declared himself the head of the HOA board. There was no vote. just a flyer in mailboxes, a slick spreadsheet of community concerns, and suddenly Carl was holding weekly meetings about quality of life enhancement. From the beginning, Carl had a problem with Eli Granger. To him, Eli's land wasn't history. It was a blemish. The open fields with scattered equipment, the tractor ruts, the rusted mailbox with bullet holes. It all offended Carl's sense of order. Where others saw tradition, Carl saw what he called rural blight. He'd even said it in a Facebook post, captioning a picture of Eli's road, one step closer to civilizing the countryside. He wasn't joking. Carl believed Walnut Estates was an oasis, clean, modern, organized, and anything outside its gates was a threat to that image. So he went to work, not with fences and hammers, but with forms and filings. Under a rarely used state property clause, Carl filed a quiet title action, a legal maneuver used to settle land ownership disputes. In it, he claimed that a section of Eli's farm road actually crossed into what the HOA deemed a protected buffer zone, a strip of land they argued was part of the neighborhood's green belt, established for conservation and safety. The county, already buried in paperwork and tight on funding, barely reviewed it. They approved the closure with a single signature, no site inspection, no review of historical easements, no consultation with affected residents. The whole thing was over in less than 2 weeks. Eli wasn't even notified until after the fact. His appeals were dismissed before they ever made it to a supervisor's desk, but Carl didn't stop there. Once the gate went up and the road was shut down, Carl had motion-activated cameras installed along the HOA's property line, most of them angled directly at Eli's equipment barn. Every time a neighbor's truck cut across a field out of habit, Carl mailed them cease and desist letters citing HOA traffic ordinances, even though the land in question didn't fall under his jurisdiction. He even tried issuing a noise violation fine to Eli after a diesel grain hauler passed within earshot of a backyard barbecue. Word traveled fast in a town like Willow Creek. Farmers at the feed store grumbled. Retired ranchers muttered about that fellow with the clipboard. A few angry locals even marched into the next HOA meeting, demanding to know who gave Carl the right to shut down a community road. But Carl never flinched. He had the papers, the permits, the printed maps, and notarized declarations. To him, that was the only truth that mattered. He sat in his folding chair at the front of the HOA clubhouse, sipping from a monogrammed tumbler and reminding everyone that they were a community of standards. And behind him, the fence stayed locked, the road remained closed, and the cameras kept rolling. Carl thought he'd won. He thought he was untouchable. He didn't realize he'd just made himself the center of a much bigger fight. Eli Granger wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't believe in shouting matches or pointless drama, but that didn't mean he didn't get angry. The road closure had cut deep, not just through his land, but through the history, purpose, and pride tied to it. He'd spent weeks watching neighbors reroute 20 extra miles, watched delivery trucks skip the valley altogether, watched fire crews take longer to respond to a barn fire 2 ridges over, and all because one man wanted to play umpire behind a wrought iron gate. But Carl Yates had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Eli was just a farmer. What he didn't know, what almost no one in Walnut Estates bothered to ask, was that before Eli came back home to run the family spread, he'd worked for the Arkansas State Department of Transportation for over 20 years. 10 of those were spent managing rural access projects, flood rerouting, and easement disputes across the Ozarks. His job title? Detour and Easement Coordinator. In other words, Eli didn't just know how roads were built. He knew how they were classified, and more importantly, how they could be reclassified. That night, Eli pulled his old credentials out of a weathered file cabinet in the feed room. His certifications were still valid, and more than a few folks in county planning remembered him. He made some calls, quiet ones, called in favors, dug through old Planning Commission archives, and found exactly what he was looking for. Statute 42B, subsection 9, tucked away in the county's Emergency Preparedness Code. It was a relic from the 1980s, created after a flash flood cut off a farming community for 3 days. The statute gave any certified rural transit official authority to propose temporary critical farm access detours, routes that could override standard traffic closures in the event of infrastructure failure, road obstructions, or agricultural emergency. It had been used only twice in 30 years, and it was still active. With the spring thaw approaching and flood season imminent, Eli drew up his plan. He documented the floodplain risk, drafted alternate route maps, gathered supporting statements from neighboring counties, and submitted everything to the planning board. He even had the paperwork notarized by a retired district court judge who'd once sat on the state's Emergency Response Committee. Then came the execution. Eli rented industrial-grade signage, the kind used for state road projects, bright orange reflective lettering mounted on metal scaffolding. Over the course of a weekend, he worked with a licensed crew to install 3 massive signs across the valley. County Emergency Detour, Authorized Route, CR 19, Granger Farm, West Bridge, mandated by Agricultural Flood Response Act 42. The final sign went up right beside the Walnut Estates gate, but he wasn't finished. Using a narrow legal clause in the county's easement code, Eli surveyed a secondary path that skirted the backside of HOA property, land technically listed as utility access, which meant it couldn't be fenced or obstructed. He had the soil tested, laid fresh gravel, and opened it as a heavy vehicle route, diverting logging trucks, grain haulers, and county equipment along a path that passed within 70 feet of Carl Yates' backyard deck. The hum of diesel engines started early, around 5:45 a.m. By 6 o'clock, the first logging truck came through, brakes hissing, tires crunching gravel. By 6:10, 3 more followed. Carl, bleary-eyed in his bathrobe, stepped outside with a mug of coffee just in time to see a convoy of farm equipment roll past his immaculately landscaped flower beds, headed toward a road he thought he had buried. He didn't know it yet, but Eli's road was back. And this time, it wasn't just a shortcut. It was a county-authorized lifeline with all the paperwork to match. And the HOA? They were about to learn that when you try to erase a man's legacy, you'd better make sure he doesn't know how to redraw the map. Carl Yates didn't go down quietly, but he did go down predictably. At first, he tried to reassert control. He emailed county officials, threatening legal action. He posted rants on the HOA forum, calling the detour an unlawful misuse of agricultural exemptions. He even tried to claim the trucks were violating noise ordinances. Never mind that his HOA didn't have jurisdiction over public traffic or county-recognized emergency routes. But none of it stuck. Eli hadn't just found a loophole. He had built a legal corridor through the heart of the HOA's argument. The county had signed off on every step. The emergency detour statute had precedence over local complaints. And the floodplain mapping, FEMA validated it. They even issued a public letter confirming the detour as part of their seasonal response model. Carl's final move came in the form of a formal complaint about the signage itself. He claimed it was visual clutter and not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics. The sheriff responded in person, calmly, directly. "If you remove, alter, or obstruct that sign again," the sheriff told Carl, hands resting on his belt, "you'll be cited for interfering with emergency infrastructure." Carl went pale. By the end of the month, the fallout inside Walnut Estates had begun to fester. Residents who once applauded Carl's standards started asking why farm traffic now rumbled through their backyard at dawn. Some were livid about the noise. Others were angry they couldn't sell their homes without explaining why their neighborhood backed up to an official county detour route. Property values took a hit, modest but noticeable. Open house showings dwindled. Real estate agents stopped mentioning peaceful surroundings in their listings. And at the next HOA meeting, things came to a head. The usually polite affair turned into a simmering storm of raised voices and folded arms. Carl tried to defend himself, waving around paperwork and talking about long-term vision. But he never saw the moment coming when Mrs. Lorna Madsen, a retired schoolteacher, known more for her knitting than her temper, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Did you really think you could outmaneuver a man who used to write Detour maps for a living?" The room went quiet. That was the end of Carl's tenure. He was voted out in less than 10 minutes. No one tore the gate down. It wasn't worth the effort. But it didn't matter. The road behind it now led to nowhere, a dead end that served as a monument to Carl's overreach. Meanwhile, Eli kept working. With the road now formally recognized by the county, he applied for an agricultural infrastructure grant. 2 months later, he got approved for full resurfacing. The gravel gave way to compacted asphalt, smooth and permanent, engineered for weather, weight, and time. And every morning, just after sunrise, Carl could hear it. The rumble of engines, the crackle of tires on pavement, the road he tried to erase, alive and thriving, echoing past his fence line like the steady beat of a drum he could no longer silence. Eli never gloated. He didn't need to. The land had spoken for him, and this time the road wasn't going anywhere.